Okay, hello everyone. It's great to see people in the room, without mask. So it's been a while since we are able to do. So this is Ki-Yuk-shin, Director of Schuldenstein Asia Pacific Research Center here at Stanford University. So this is a special seminar jointly organized by CDDRN and Schuldenstein APAC. So I'm very happy to introduce Professor Steve Kotkin from Princeton University. So he'll be speaking on modern authoritarianism and geopolitics, thoughts on policy framework. So I think given what's happening in the world, especially in Ukraine, this seminar cannot be more timely. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our speaker and also introduce our moderator, Catherine Stoner, also director of CDDRN. So, as you know, Professor Steve Kotkin is a John Birkelund Professor of History and International Affairs at Princeton University, as well as adjunct senior fellow at the Hoover Institution here at Stanford. So he directs the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies and co-directs its program in history and the practice of diplomacy, which he founded. He also founded Princeton's Global History Initiative. Its scholarship covers geopolitics and authoritarian regimes in history and in the present. Professor Kotkin has published 2 volumes of a 3-volume history of the world as seen through Stalin's desk, Paradoxes of Power, 1878 to 1928, and Waiting for Hitler, 1929 to 1941. The final volume, Totalitarian Superpower, 1941 to 1990, is underway. He writes reviews and essays for Foreign Affairs, the Times Literary Supplement, and the Wall Street Journal, and served as a business book reviewer for the New York Times Sunday business section. He's an occasional consultant for government and some private companies. So he had PhD from UC Berkeley in 1988. So after Professor Kotkin speaks, Dr. Catherine Stoner will be moderating. So please submit your questions to Q&A button if you're joining virtually. So without further ado, let me welcome Professor Kotkin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity today. This is the first, I think, presentation I've made, which is not expressly on the war in Ukraine for the past month. So it's a chance to zoom out a little bit before we zoom back in. This is based on a course I've been teaching for many decades here at Princeton University and work that I've been doing as a consultant. It's going to be in 3 parts today. I'm going to give an introductory discussion of modern authoritarianism and how we understand it. And then I'm going to go more deeply into what I consider to be the 5 main elements for a policy framework. And then in the 3rd section, I'm going to talk about geopolitics, or one of those 5 elements in the framework, at greater length. So now the 1st section. Everybody will know that authoritarianism studies really took shape in relation to the dictatorships of the 20th century, right? Especially the Nazi and the Soviet dictatorships. Where did these totalitarian regimes come from? What, if anything, distinguished them? And what could we do about them? Sometimes Mussolini's regime was included, sometimes it wasn't included, even though the Italian fascists were the ones who invented the concept of totalitarianism, but it's really mostly the Nazi and Soviet regime. Totalitarianism has always been and remains unrivaled in its power to discredit a regime as evil. When you call something totalitarian, it's about the worst thing in the world. And so as a policy tool, totalitarianism has been invaluable. But the preoccupation with Hitler and Stalin, with these special kinds of dictatorship, made it difficult to understand the other kinds. And so enter Juan Linz. Juan Linz, the sociologist. Linz was born in the Weimar Republic. He grew up in Spain. His mother was Spanish. He studied at University of Madrid, got his PhD at Columbia University down the block here from me in New York, and he taught at Yale from 1968. And what Linz did was to say that we have these two categories, democratic and totalitarian, but Francisco Franco's regime in Spain was neither completely democratic nor completely totalitarian. It was something else. And he presented this at a research paper at a conference in Finland in 1963, the International Conference of Political Sociology, which was organized by Raymond Aron. And in 1964, the next year, Linz published this Spain, an authoritarian regime. And in many ways, this 1964 paper by Linz is the beginning of non-totalitarian authoritarian studies. The problem, however, was that Linz had mostly a negative definition of authoritarianism. It didn't really have an ideology, a single ideology. It didn't really have mass mobilization. It didn't really have a concentrated single source of power. It had multiple sources of power reflecting many interest groups. So authoritarianism was not totalitarianism by and large. Now that's what Linz came out with, the negative qualities of authoritarianism. Totalitarianism had a central or monistic center of power, it had an official ideology, had mass mobilization. 11 years later, Linz tried to refine this difference in an essay called Totalitarianism, Totalitarian and Authoritarian Regimes, 1975, in the Handbook of Political Science, more than 250-page essay. Once again, he had some trouble giving positive as opposed to negative qualities to distinguish authoritarianism. Linz went on to try to do typologies. He co-edited a book on so-called sultanistic regimes, for example, as a typology of authoritarianism. Today, that would be highly problematic, as it was in part then, as an Orientalist kind of terminology, sultanistic regimes. Anyway, Linz had a hard time with the typologies of authoritarianism, the different kinds, and he was not alone in this difficult time. We had all sorts of attempts to give a typology for authoritarianism over the last decades, right? Semi-democracy, virtual democracy, electoral democracy, and pseudo-democracy for a time, eventually became illiberal democracy, and then semi-authoritarianism, soft authoritarianism, electoral authoritarianism, and then the lovely designation by Freedom House, partly free. And so I don't think we're going to do better than Juan Linz. And I don't think, as to say, we bow down before Juan Linz. And I don't think we're going to resolve this typology problem very easily. And so instead, I propose a policy approach, a policy framework, the way that totalitarianism is an incredibly powerful policy tool against certain regimes. I'd like to come up with a useful policy framework for authoritarianism, which won't satisfy those who prefer strict definitions and typologies, but can be very useful in combating authoritarian regimes in the policy world. So let me just end the first part of this with an introduction. End the introduction here with a definition. A basic definition. The basic definition we have comes in 1981 from someone named Amos Perlmutter. And Perlmutter was a scholar of the Middle East, and he defined authoritarianism, modern authoritarianism, this way. He said the early version of authoritarianism was ruled by the few in the name of the few, but modern authoritarianism is the rule by the few in the name of the many. And I think this is a very powerful definition. Ruled by the few in the name of the many. De Tocqueville had dismissed the pretensions of authoritarians. Alexis de Tocqueville had dismissed their pretensions to hide behind constitutional facades and try to create the illusion that they could combine prerogatives of absolute power with the moral authority that comes from popular assent, precisely the definition that Perlmutter would come up with 150 years later. Tocqueville was right about so much, but he was wrong about this. Authoritarian regimes have been capable of simulating constitutionalism and democracy while promoting illiberalism, and they achieved mass political incorporation without empowerment of the people. This power of the democratic facade also has tremendous vulnerabilities, and maybe we'll get to that in the end. So to sum up this first section, a policy framework is one way, not the only way, to approach the subject, and that's the way that I'm approaching it today. Now, section 2, the 5 dimensions of an authoritarian regime, the policy framework that I'm proposing. The first dimension won't surprise anybody, and that's coercive mechanisms. Obviously, you need police, you need a military security apparatus, and in fact, what we see with authoritarian regimes is a nearly infinite variety of coercive mechanisms. Many of the coercive mechanisms overlap, they're at cross purposes, they fight against each other. Sometimes they're a little more integrated, but often they're not integrated precisely because if they get too strong, they can overthrow whoever's in power. And so there are quite a lot of incentives to have a fractured or a fragmented coercive mechanisms and to pit them against each other. You can't get very far without coercive mechanisms with an authoritarian regime. So it's kind of the sine qua non of every authoritarian regime. And they're better and worse at this, and they vary, as I said, not just in structure, but in quality, the coercive mechanisms. I think this point doesn't need further elucidation, but I'm happy to return to it in the questions. The second dimension I would point to is revenue streams. Revenue streams or cash flow. Many of us have been really appalled at the discussions around a so-called social contract between the people in an authoritarian regime and the regime. The idea, for example, that the people traded their freedom in exchange for a higher standard of living for some kind of GDP growth, and that this was a quasi, if not an actual, de jure contract, a kind of quasi or de facto social contract, right? We understand we're giving up some of our freedoms, but in exchange, we do better financially, materially. There was never any contract between an authoritarian regime and the public, because if the regime failed to provide the economic growth, if it failed to raise living standards, it wasn't going to say to the people, oh, I'm sorry, we violated our side of the bargain, we violated the contract, we're going to leave power now. Nor could the people enforce the so-called contract on the regime. If the regime failed to deliver growth, it could just turn up the repression, use those coercive mechanisms, and turn up some other tools that it had. And so it's not about economic growth. Regimes can survive without economic growth, but they cannot survive without cash flow. The best version of cash flow is the kind that comes up out of the ground, the kind that Mother Nature deposited several 100 million years ago, and all you have to do is extract it. That could be hydrocarbons, that could be diamonds or other precious metals and minerals. If it's underground and all you have to do is extract it, you're not dependent on the populace whatsoever for consent. And so it's very convenient to have that source of cash flow. And as I said, cash flow is absolutely critical for an authoritarian regime. Economic growth is fine, but cash flow is far more important. Okay, number 3, the third dimension, what I call control over life chances. The more that the regime can deny or control your life chances, for example, your employment, if there's state employment as opposed to a private sector, a very high percentage of state employment, maybe even 100% of the jobs are state employment. If the education system is state, if the ability to travel abroad is controlled by the state, if the ability to go on holiday at home, if your housing is controlled by the state. In other words, the more the state controls your life chances, the more the state has power over you and the less power you have. And so this control over life chances will also vary. Sometimes state employment will be a lower number, 20, 30, 40%. Sometimes it will be a higher number, 80, 90%. And so if, for example, you don't like the regime and you might not want to cooperate with the regime, it's fine if you run your own business, potentially. It's fine if there are private schools to send your children. It's potentially fine if there's a private housing market where you can buy and rent housing, or you can do just about whatever else you want in private fashion with a big private sector. However, with state control over life chances, any opposition to the regime could affect not just yourself, but the rest of your family or other associates. And so this is a really big and important aspect. So if the first one is kind of the political mechanisms, coercive mechanisms, then the second one's kind of the economic story, the revenue stream, especially one that can be easily extracted from the ground. And the third one is really the society sociological piece of this, the control over life chances. The fourth dimension in my 5 dimensions is what I call the stories, the narratives, which also vary tremendously across these regimes, but there are certain patterns. The stories and the narratives will involve external enemies and internal enemies. It'll involve a great past, a story of national greatness, which was either lost or suppressed by enemies and needs to be recaptured somehow. A way in which this national greatness was potentially denied by enemies, but can be revived or is being revived. Overcoming humiliations and mistreatment, the whataboutism and moral equivalence. And there are many other dimensions to this stories, narratives, fourth piece, the kind of humanistic piece. Stories are ultimately much more powerful than coercive mechanisms. Much more than coercive mechanisms. You can't get by without coercive mechanisms, but ultimately the stories and the narratives really have the power. And moreover, people do not accept stories and narratives. They don't accept propaganda unless they're willing to believe it in the first place. Propaganda is very ineffective unless there's some purchase there within the populace to receive it. I should say that sometimes we consider censorship the denial of information, and certainly it does that. It suppresses information. But censorship also involves the promotion of lots of information and certain ways of seeing the world. And that's where the stories and the narratives come in. This is an inexhaustible dimension of authoritarian regimes, and we've seen quite a bit of ingenuity and cleverness over the last several decades in this category. Okay, fifth and final dimension is the international environment, the international system, the international order. Is it conducive or corrosive to authoritarianism? And here I would argue that the international dimension, the international order, is simultaneously conducive and corrosive to authoritarian regimes, but it matters tremendously the degree which way that goes. And so the kind of Western complicity or the democratic regime, the liberal order, the rule of order complicity in the opacity and other systems that enable authoritarianism is now come to the fore with the latest events in the world, but it has been a long-standing problem. And so now if you take these 5 dimensions, the political institutions one, the economics, the cash flow one, the sociological life chances one, the humanistic stories narrative one, and then the international relations theory or the IR one, the international system, you get in many ways what I think a comprehensive framework for understanding authoritarian regimes, but more importantly, for combating authoritarian regimes, for thinking through and potentially implementing policies that reduce the scope of authoritarian regimes, play on their vulnerabilities and weaknesses, rather than facilitating them. Okay, now let me turn to the third and final section of the presentation, which is geopolitics. And I'm going to open up this 5th dimension, the international system, conducive or corrosive to authoritarian regimes. There are a lot of aspects to the 5th dimension. For example, the fertile ground of anti-Western ideology. Anti-Western ideology in various forms is probably the most globally resonant ideology in the world and has been for the last 2 centuries. Anti-Westernism takes many different forms. Anti-imperialism, communism was a big package of anti-Westernism and still is, but not only communism. So we could talk quite a bit about anti-Westernism. I'm not going to do that right now. Ironically, US democracy promotion has also been an issue for being conducive towards authoritarian regimes because of its occasional perverse and unintended consequences. You can argue that the attempt to democratize Iraq, the Iraq War, you can argue this. I'm not suggesting everyone has to accept this, but you can argue that that attempt to knock off Saddam's regime and trip the Middle East by implanting a democratic rule of law order in Iraq had perverse and unintended consequences that facilitated many authoritarian moves and consolidations in the Middle East. Arguably a worse outcome in some ways than Saddam's regime, as horrible, as brutal as Saddam's regime was. I'm not going to talk in depth about that. Democracy promotion has had many consequences, not only perverse and unintended ones. A third one I could talk about would be commodity prices. The beauty of this is that authoritarian regime instability raises commodity prices, often benefiting themselves. For example, you can invade your neighbor, and as a result of which the price of oil can skyrocket and your balance of payments can go way up and your budget can be in surplus. That's what we're seeing today, obviously, in the Russian case. And so there are many ways in which commodity prices are a decisive factor in being conducive or corrosive to authoritarian regimes. The Soviet regime had a great deal of trouble when oil prices tanked in 1985, 86, right when Gorbachev came to power. I should say that in this package of commodity prices, the ability to take advantage of money laundering and reputation laundering services, which has long been the case for authoritarian regimes. This was true all throughout the Cold War. Taking advantage of money laundering and reputation laundering services in the world has been very conducive to authoritarian regimes and still is, even though there's been some revelations about this recently. A fourth possibility here in the 5th dimension in the international relations in this geopolitics story is the story of technology transfer. Authoritarian regimes rarely create their own important high-end technology, but they do import technology. And so the issue of technology transfer and export controls is absolutely vital to whether the international order is conducive or corrosive of authoritarian regimes. The easier technology transfer, the more conducive it turns out, and the harder the export controls are, the more export controls are imposed, the more difficult it is for authoritarian regimes. I should say that the Soviet Union, the first 2 5-year plans, every single technology used in the first and second five-year plan by Stalin, every single one was imported with the sole exception of synthetic rubber. So the best Western firms from the United States, France, Italy, Germany, were the ones who transferred the technology to Stalin's regime and enabled that regime to become the totalitarian superpower for a time that it was. There was an irony here in that during World War II, all of that technology was used by the Soviet regime to produce weapons and to fight Nazi Germany. And so we often talk about the contribution of Lend-Lease, which was very substantial to the Soviet war effort. But prior to that, all the technology transfer of the interwar five-year plans allowed the Soviets to develop a military-industrial complex, which people say the Soviets manufactured all of their own weapons during the war, for the most part, and Lend-Lease was relatively less important on the weapon side, more important on the supply and everyday life side. And that's partly true, because, except for the fact that that technology was transferred to the Soviets, with which they used to manufacture those weapons. Anyway, let's move on. Then there is a kind of, how to say this, best practice, authoritarian diffusion, authoritarian learning. This is another important dimension. Vladimir Putin's regime became a kind of school of authoritarianism globally, how to make a kleptocracy function, how to fake an opposition, how to fake NGOs, how to criminalize foreign funding and foreign influence, how to employ state TV and information war, and then, of course, demonstrating audacity in a brazen murdering of perceived regime enemies, even on foreign soil, which was enormously popular and still is among the authoritarians globally. Putin kind of cast a spell as a strongman. And so the existence of a seemingly ostensibly successful authoritarian regime is just as important, maybe more important than all the previous factors I just named in this fifth dimension, the geopolitical dimension. Finally, let me get to the China story. And here I want to spend a little bit of time. And this will be where we'll summarize the whole presentation, the China story as an authoritarian regime, as an alternative for other countries in the world that don't want to be under the Western umbrella or subjugated by Western interests or bow to Western human rights or democracy promotion. China has created an enormous space in the system. So let me now back up a little bit and talk about this Chinese regime in a larger East Asian context. Everybody knows the story of how the East Asian countries post-World War II grew to be enormously successful economies, right? The story begins with Japan rising from the ashes of World War II destruction and defeat and becoming the second largest economy in the world for a time, and doing that predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly by gaining access to the American domestic market and being able to manufacture and export quality goods at reasonable prices that the American middle class was only too happy to acquire. And so this model of wide access without reciprocity to the American domestic consumer market, plus your ability to manufacture those goods which Americans wanted and would pay for, right? Romania, Poland in the Cold War were not able to manufacture the kinds of things that were in high demand by Western consumers, even if they had similar access to the American consumer market. So give the Japanese enormous credit for this ability, but also the gigantic size and insatiable avarice, if you will, demand on the side of the American middle class is really a big driver here. This was then reproduced in many ways in South Korea and Taiwan, as you know. So you have the Japan example, the South Korean example, the Taiwan example, all of which gained pretty large substantial access to the American consumer market, and all of which figure out how to manufacture those goods in order to sell them into that market. And so the American middle class in some ways builds the post-war middle class in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. The story is more complicated than that, of course. There are many other factors. It's not the political economy story that's most interesting for me today, although it is an important story. I want to talk about the political side in terms of institutions and democratization. So we can argue the extent to which the model of getting rich, building your own middle class through access and manufacturing export to the American domestic middle class was one factor among others, but I don't think you can exclude it as a factor. What was very interesting about this phenomenon, however, is that Japan was a rule of law democratic regime, but of course South Korea wasn't and Taiwan wasn't for the longest time. They ended up democratizing. And so the story of how South Korea and Taiwan democratized is an enormously important story, just like the political economy story is, and it misled us. Here I want to bring in mainland China. And so what you have with mainland China is another complicated political economy story where Deng Xiaoping lived really across a very short body of water from Japan and watched Japan go from the vanquished, destroyed World War II power to this colossal post-war success through this access to the American domestic market. And Deng Xiaoping pretty much said, you know, that's for us too. And so he went to the United States, the first communist leader, as you know, to go to the United States, invitation of Jimmy Carter in 1979. And he decided that communist China, mainland China, would follow this pattern of hitching its wagon to the American economic engine, gaining access to the American domestic market, and pulling off a Japan, South Korea, Taiwan story on an even larger scale, potentially. And so communist China gained most favored nation trading status already under the Carter administration, late 79, early 1980. And then that was renewed, as you know, until finally it was made permanent much later on. But nonetheless, it worked. There were many other factors, of course, and we can talk about those other factors and the balance between the different factors, but there's no denying that the Chinese communist regime embarked on this massive geopolitical switch from the Soviet economic model to the American domestic market through the Japanese style manufacturers for export to American consumers. Now, as South Korea and Taiwan democratized, as we said, really important processes that we're kind of glancing over right here. Many people assumed that communist China was on this same path. That is to say that it would follow Japan, in the first instance, South Korea and Taiwan, first through economic liberalization and then through political liberalization in some version of modernization theory. However, I argued, and I have been arguing for a very long time, that that was not going to happen. And the reason that was not going to happen was not because communist China lacked some kind of cultural characteristics, innate characteristics that the others had. In fact, it shares a lot of cultural characteristics. My argument was that China was a communist regime, and there is no political reform equilibrium in a communist regime. Communist regimes can open up economically. They can undergo economic liberalization, certainly for a time. And this is done usually to strengthen the communist monopoly. But it cannot liberalize politically because you cannot be half communist, just like you cannot be half pregnant. You're either a communist monopoly or your monopoly begins to unravel. We saw this in Hungary in 1956, in Prague in 1968, under Gorbachev in the 80s. And of course, the communist regime spent a great deal of time studying the Soviet collapse and teaching it in party schools, and understands this reform, the lack of a reform equilibrium. If you try to democratize inside one party, what happens is people decide to use that democratization to say, no, I don't like this party. I want other parties. In other words, the communist monopoly comes under threat. Political liberalization is a form of auto liquidation. So communist regimes that embark on political liberalization either end up destroying themselves in an auto liquidation or provoking an internal crackdown to reverse the political liberalization. In fact, over time, they also become worried about the economic liberalization because the accumulation of independent wealth and therefore power by individuals also in the economy also threatens the communist monopoly. And so they begin to reassert their power in the economy and to reverse the economic liberalization. They can't live without the economic liberalization because it's the GDP driver. It drives the GDP growth. It creates the jobs. It's massively important if you want to grow the economy, but it's an ipso facto threat to the monopoly of the regime. And so you'll see the political liberalization come under stress at a certain point in a communist regime. And so if we look at the East Asian story, it's really important that we misunderstood the possibilities, in my view at least, of political liberalization in China. Instead, what we did was a massive technology transfer and buildup and access to the American consumer market and many other ways that we built bridges in order to enable the growth in the power of an authoritarian regime, which could not liberalize politically without entering this problem of no reform equilibrium and potential auto liquidation. And so it looked like it was a great story. And certainly in the case of Japan, post-World War II Japan, post-World War II South Korea and Taiwan, it has been an incredible story. And it's been crucial for the world system and for democracies in general, not just for those individual countries, as big as it's been in those countries. And so now we face a situation where anti-Western ideology has this fertile ground, it's globally resonant, where democracy promotion had some perverse and unintended consequences, as well as some positive consequences, where money laundering and reputation laundering services are very lucrative and widely available, where technology transfer as opposed to export controls has been predominant, and where we've had a regime in Russia which has taught the other authoritarians or would-be authoritarians how to get it done and how to be brazen about it. And biggest of all, we have the China story, which is, as I said, a very large space in the international system. This is not a story, in my view, that everything China is and does is bad. This is not a China bashing story. China, like Russia, is a remarkable civilization. So is Iran. It's got tremendous achievements. The last several decades of what the Chinese have done in their country is just pretty astonishing. There's no other word for it. At the same time, however, it's not the kind of regime that's conducive to the values and institutions that the people in the United States and our allies hold dear. And so now we have to figure out how to make the international order, how to make the international system, this fifth dimension, more corrosive to authoritarian regimes and less conducive. I could talk about the vulnerabilities, but at this point, I think I'll stop. Thank you, and go back to the moderator, the chair, if there are any questions.
Okay, we're just unmuting, Steve. Are we unmuted?
We are unmuted.
We're unmuted. Can you hear me, Steve?
Yes, it's Stanford. I know the technology is really difficult for you there.
The technology actually surprisingly, it is, right, okay. So thank you very much. That was really stimulating and interesting. Especially for me, since we, and perhaps some of my colleagues at CDRL, we've been doing a group once a month on Thursdays, and our loose theme has been authoritarianism and democracy and erosion of democracy. So the framework's really interesting. I know my job is, of course, to moderate questions, and we have actually hundreds of people online on listening to this. And so but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and also ask a question or two, since no one is grabbing the mic from me. So I have to, I guess, choose between my questions. On the one hand, the dimensions strike me as very reasonable, 5 dimensions. But on the other hand, the recommendation is, is basically, or the description is basically really broad, right? So big states, highly coercive, national mythology, perpetuated by propaganda and technology, and something triggers global disillusionment with liberalism. So it doesn't strike me as terribly different from what we were hearing about totalitarianism with Hannah Arendt and others after the Second World War. And also some democracies, of course, have these characteristics, that is big state, some degree of coercion, a national mythology, propaganda machines, I suppose, or the media, and the same, facing the same international environment. So why do some states who have those dimensions become the rule of the few over the many, while others maintain liberal democracy in the face of the same geopolitical tensions? So that's one aspect. And then second, you didn't say much about the role of ideology. And at the risk of invoking my colleague, who I think is online, Frank Fukuyama, I was starting to teach my class Understanding Russia this quarter. And the night before, I reread The End of History, often misquoted, misunderstood article, basically though saying that not that this is the end of non-democracies, but that this is the end of alternative ideas or ideologies to democracy. So is the kind of authoritarian framework that you're describing, it seems that there is ideological. There is no ideology that produces a model of governing that can be perpetuated around the world. And why is that? Why is there no role for, as you said, the values that we hold dear? There isn't an ideology. There isn't a sort of set of sort of philosophical principles in these modern authoritarian regimes as you describe them. So those two questions.
Yes, thank you. So the bigger conundrum is, where do liberal orders come from? Where do rule of law, the democratic liberal orders come from, and how do they form? It's not such a big conundrum. Where do authoritarian regimes come from, and how do they survive? However, let me just point out here that a liberal order, a rule of law order, involves constraints on executive power. And those constraints are not circumstantial. They're not constraints, for example, that arise out of the fact that the country is large or the communications network is primitive, or whatever else might be. The leader is a moron. They're not circumstantial constraints on executive power. They're institutional, constitutional, and values constraints on executive power. And authoritarian regimes, they lack institutional constraints on executive power, except when they introduce them themselves because they're afraid that the coercive mechanisms become too strong, for example, and threaten the leader or the leadership group, right? So for the most part, it's the differential is the presence or absence of constraints on executive power. And that's a category which allows for very wide variation. Rather than an either or, It allows for massive variation, so you can have stronger and weaker constraints on executive power, for example. On the totalitarian versus authoritarian problem, so if you have 100% control over life chances, you're more in the totalitarian side of the equation than the authoritarian side of the equation. In other words, if the employment is only the state and education is only the state and every housing and food, your entire livelihood is only the state, then you have the possibility of totalitarianism. But for the most part, the control over life chances is far less than it was under the totalitarian regimes. And so it's never absolute, but it's very far from absolute right now in most cases. And China has tremendous private sector, and even Russia, for a time, had a private sector, although it's hard to say what they've got now or what they'll have going forward. And so we don't want to seem like everything is either totalitarian or not, because that's a way you bash the regimes. But it's a high bar for me to get to totalitarianism. The difference might be also described as, in a totalitarian regime, you're forced to participate actively, whereas in an authoritarian regime, passive acquiescence is more than okay for the vast majority of people. In other words, you don't necessarily oppose it, but you don't have to get up and make a speech every day or denounce everybody else or affirmatively participate in the regime the way you are in a mobilization or a totalitarian regime. But let's get to the more important question of ideology. So my fourth category, stories and narratives, that's ideology. And that, as I said, is the most powerful by far of the dimensions for an authoritarian regime. If it has stories that it's able to tell about itself that have purchase in the population, those stories are almost always anti-Western. Authoritarian regimes are anti-Western with almost no exception. There are a handful of potential exceptions, and we can argue about them. So that's a profound, globally resonant ideology, which is shared by some non-authoritarian regimes, like, for example, how do you characterize India? Certainly, there's a lot of anti-Westernism coursing through India, but just in general, the power of the West produces a backlash, which is fertile ground for the possibility of a national greatness denied ideology, which is common across almost all authoritarian regimes. And so the ideological dimension is fill in the blank. What's my national greatness? Who are my enemies? Who denied my national greatness? Where's my cult of the leader? Right? And on it goes. And so it's a package of narratives and stories, which you could call ideology if you want. The problem with calling it ideology is, once again, the association immediately with totalitarian regimes. And I'm trying to describe authoritarian regimes. So I'm calling it stories and narratives. They can be fictional. Most of them are lies, or 50% lies, half truths. Right? So I believe that there are powerful ideologies that are rooted in the fertile ground of anti-Westernism and the national greatness, internal, external enemies, fifth column stuff, and then various other pieces besides that, right? For example, the elites betray, and the people, the blood, the people close to the soil, right, are pure. Or let's get rid of intermediate institutions that foil the will of the leader who's trying to work on behalf of the people, right? So judiciary, media, all intermediate institutions are evil. That's also part of the package very successfully. And yes, it's not limited only to authoritarian regimes, and that's a problem, and it's a problem to combat, right? We're not suggesting that there are completely separate categories of regimes, good regimes and bad regimes. Democratic liberal orders 100% and authoritarian regimes 100%. Our framework allows you to do policy work inside rule of law orders too, if you start to see some of these attributes some of these behaviors, etc. I wouldn't go too far with that and put them in some type of moral equivalency, but that's what the policy framework enables us to do. Now, once again, this is a policy framework, and I think it leads to very practical, very, very practical options. So for example, if cash flow, if revenue streams is a fundamental dimension, then denying that cash flow, blocking those revenue streams, blocking access to the reserve currency, blocking access to the international financial system, and the whole package of sanctions that we've developed, right, attacks the revenue streams, for example. Information war attacks the narratives and the stories. We don't do it quite the same as we had with Radio Free Europe and Deutsche Welle and et cetera, but that clearly was aimed at the stories and the narratives. And one could go on here in the ways in which the dimensions open up into actionable, practical policy measures, and that those are applicable for better or for worse to regimes depending on their size and depending on how much leverage they have over the international system. I don't know if I've answered your questions, but they provoke those thoughts in me.
Okay, no, that was very helpful. Okay, so we have some questions in the room and then we have questions accumulating online. We're going to 1:30.
We're going into 2.
Oh, we're going to 2. Okay, so we have some time. Okay, so Tom Finger, why don't you start us off here in the room?
Thank you.
And introduce yourself just in.
Tom Finger, a fellow here in APARC. Steve, I think this approach, the policy framework, is terrific. Coming at it as my former operator in the government, I think it's a very, very useful way to get at it. What I would like you to say a little more about is the interactions among the pillars of authoritarian regimes, which are also the vulnerability of these regimes. And using China a little bit as an illustration. China, like the other East Asian tigers, has no resources. The only resources are human. That makes it different than the Middle East or rentier economies elsewhere. So why do we think China is successful or important or influential? It's because of the economic performance that it has achieved, which is slowing, even without deliberate attempts to slow its growth. That has produced responses on other pillars, more coercion and greater control, or what you refer to as life choices. Keep these bad ideas, keep the foreign news reporting from undermining the narrative. The narrative is a mix of party, only the party can save China, and national greatness or identity. So the two specific questions I've got is, do you have, or have you thought through some of the interactive as one or another pillar is affected, how authoritarian regimes compensate and correct in other areas, and what those of us who were involved in putting together what became known as engagement policy with China, as we thought about it, was there was going to be a point at which Chinese leaders had to choose between the party and the nation, that preserving the party or achieving national greatness, that as you did things to reimpose control, you slowed growth. As you slowed growth, you failed to meet expectations of the public and undermine. But I'll stop there. I hope we have a continuing dialogue. But the interaction among the pillars is the key question.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's great to see you, even though only virtually. It's precisely people like yourself that I first developed this framework for. And it's precisely people like yourself that I've been discussing this framework for now just about 20 plus years. And so this question has come up before. Let me just say that the framework I presented for purposes of discussion was a simplified version in order to meet the time requirements, and the interactive quality, as well as the complexity systems theory version of the international system and how actions in one place affect actions far elsewhere with nonlinear causation, et cetera. That's a very important piece of the framework as well, but it's a little bit too complex for the presentation today, but needs to be elaborated. Now let's talk about the pillars. So it would have been my view that there was not going to be a choice between party and a nation, precisely because the party can fold in the nation in a way that's successful under that fourth category, stories and narratives, and be able to use the coercive mechanisms as well as the economic wherewithal from the cash flow, the revenues, and of course, the control over life chances. And so that choice was not going to be one they had to confront. And if they do have to confront it, which may be the case going forward, because, for example, the growth model has hit a wall, because as your own Scott Rosell demonstrated in that brilliant book, the middle income trap is a very serious challenge facing the communist regime, the demographic stuff that you know about, and then the fact that the party cannot tolerate alternative sources of power like an empowered private sector. And so we're now going to see the extent to which your long-term view here, where party and nation were in contradiction and a choice had to be made, we're now going to see if that's the case, or because the international system is conducive, not corrosive, that is to say the technology transfer continues, especially high-end technology transfer continues, because the stories and narratives about national greatness continue to work and be associated with the party, and because the repressive mechanisms, the coercive mechanisms continue to be excellent, and they have been refined and improved just in the time since you left government in many remarkable ways, and they were already pretty successful before while you were in government. And so it could well be that the wherewithal is in there, and that we continue, rather than to be corrosive and to try to separate party and nation, we continue to transfer high-end technology on which all of these regimes are absolutely fundamentally make or break dependent, right? And so maybe you're right, and maybe this contradiction will be insurmountable in the short time if the regime cannot get its 5.5% growth, which it won't get, although it will lie about it, and then we'll test your theory. My view is it could well be that the regime survives that, provided the technology transfer continues. Now, as far as the pillars and interaction, right? What we see there is recourse to greater repression when economic challenges arise. So one of the things I've been discussing with some government bodies is the Senkaku Island problem. Everyone's focused on Taiwan, but as you know better than I do, the Senkaku Islands are controlled by the Japanese, but they're claimed also by China, which has a different name for them. And in my view, the ability to employ anti-Japanese nationalism in China is nearly unlimited. If you run into any economic difficulties at home, you can turn on the anti-Japanese tap and you can let it go full throttle, or you can let it go really far for a couple of reasons. One is the Japanese will tolerate a tremendous amount of anti-Japanese sentiment in China and still continue to trade with China and exchange technology with China. And the other is it's inexhaustible among the Chinese population at large. What I see is he runs into trouble with the economy, and he makes an amphibious landing on the Senkaku Islands, opens up a weather station, a weather station in a box. It's a civilian weather station. It's for peace purposes, and it's just to help the whole region. And it's kind of like the coral reefs in the South China Sea, where we're not really militarizing. And so it starts out as a weather station, and then it becomes some kind of military installation. And neither the Japanese nor the Americans are going to go to war over this fait accompli of the seizure and potential militarization of the Senkaku Islands. And moreover, the domestic anti-Japanese nationalism gets ramped up very successfully and drowns out some of the issues having to do with hitting a wall potentially on the economic side, right? So that would be an example, in my view, of the interaction of the pillars, where you have policy options as a regime, and you just need the audacity to try them, to enact them. And you can also turn them off if they backfire on you. You can tone it back down because you have control over turning it on and turning off. You're confident in your coercive mechanisms. You're confident in your narrative stories, both the suppression of certain kinds of information and the promotion of other kinds. And so if you run into domestic difficulties, you have options, either transforming or using more some of the other pillars in the equation. Now, the bigger problem for China is not Japan. This is something I think is a tool for them. The bigger problem for China, of course, is Europe. And this is where the regime has really gotten into big trouble. The Chinese grand strategy recently has been, we're going to be at loggerheads with the Americans. That's inevitable because they're trying to hold down our rise. We can't expect anything better from them. Americans are innately given to global domination, and therefore they will never be able to tolerate China's rise. So yes, that is lost, although we don't want a complete decoupling because we still need the high-end technology transfer in the short and medium term, and we may need it even longer than that. But we have Europe as our ace in the hole. You see, because we drove a wedge between the Americans and the Europeans, and the Europeans are a trade-first entity, or as it was once said by one of those long-lasting German chancellors, Wandel durch Handel, right? That kind of illusion that you get change through trade. And so the Europeans were willing to absorb just about any insults or misbehavior on the part of the Chinese, but please don't disrupt the economic relations, the trade relations, which are enormously important for the everyday life, quality of life among the Europeans. And so now China has put this at risk over its perception, the global perception that's an accomplice of Russia's invasion of China. And so what had been a wedge between America and Europe is now solidarity on the China issue, not just on the Russia issue. And that risks the whole game for China. And that's much worse than demographic challenges at home, for example, than having to lie about 5.5% growth when you're really well under that number. If they lose the trade relationship with Europe, their grand strategy has nowhere to go in terms of technology transfer, even if they keep the Japanese on side, which they have been able to do and will be able to do in my estimation, right? So here's where I see the fifth factor, the geopolitical dimension, right? The conducive, corrosive international order. The Chinese own behavior has put at risk what had been a very conducive international environment for them. And it would have cost them very little to make sure that wedge between Europe and America stayed open or maybe even got wider. But instead, Xi Jinping has done the bromance with Putin as more important than the trade relationship with Europe, at least for the time being. And so To me, Tom, that interaction of the mistakes of an authoritarian regime, of the despotism of an authoritarian regime, of the lack of corrective mechanisms, right? As you know, there's debate, there's efflorescence, in fact, below the level of Xi Jinping. In fact, they're incandescent, many people, about what's going on in China's grand strategy, but the despotism so far is impervious to that. So you know, that's a long answer to your important question, but I'm just trying to show that it is the right question, and that I do have something of a response, and that I hope we get to talk more about in person.
All right, thanks, Steve. We have a lot of questions here in the room and also online. So I'm just going to turn online, and then I'll turn back to my colleagues in the room. So Andy, this is from Andrew Walder, who you know, who asks, how does the story of voluntary self-liquidation that we observed in Poland and Hungary in 1988-89 fit with your analysis? What might be characterized as one of autocratic permanence under certain conditions, if not authoritarian resilience?
So the Polish and Hungarian regimes gave up. They gave up the ghost. They knew, the East Germans, to an extent, one could make a similar argument, although not as strong. They knew that they lived in a Western dominated world, and they knew that they lost the geopolitical competition. And they also knew that the only way out was a further repression, that coercive mechanism, which they were unsure would remain loyal and obedient to them. And so what the Polish regime tried to do, and it failed, was to stay in power through a deal. It had an unpayable debt in foreign currency, and it attempted to purchase the legitimacy of the opposition to have that debt excused or at least reduced, and be able to get out of the rut that they were in, the dependency that they were in, with the massive foreign currency debt incurred in order to import consumer goods. And they were shocked when they went into the deal with the opposition, just how spectacularly the population rejected the communist regime in 99 of 100 of the seats they were allowed to contend. And even though the communist regime in Poland retained the majority, it had already hollowed out. It was led by a general. Only the repressive mechanisms were still there. And using those repressive mechanisms, they were unsure. They used them in 1981, as you know, December 13th, 81. And they bought themselves some time, but they decided not to use them again. The Hungarian case is fabulous because the Hungarian regime had to help put the opposition together in order to get the round table across the other side. There had been an opposition in Hungary, but it had not been as organized as the one in Poland, as there had been less solidarity, more fragmentation. And so the Hungarian communists worked hard to help put the opposition together. You know the story in East Germany with the peace marches and the accidental opening, partly accidental opening of the wall. And so what you have is a capitulation, an implosion among the elites in the East Bloc who knew the game was up and didn't have the wherewithal to hold on. Whereas in the Chinese case, of course, you have Tiananmen around the same time. And in fact, the mobilization is far greater in China than in Poland or Hungary in '89. There's no comparison of the kind of mobilization you have in China compared to Poland and Hungary, but the elites gave out. They also knew the history of Prague Spring, and they also knew what Gorbachev was doing domestically. And so you have a loss of will, but also a loss of the corrosion or hollowing out of the instruments, right? Let's remember that these regimes lived under so-called communism. In their mind, exploitation of the workers and under capitalism and imperialism, and yet all their status symbols were imported goods from the capitalist world. The clothes they wore, the food they ate, the vehicles that they drove, the furniture in their apartments. Everything was capitalist. That was a status symbol in these regimes. It sapped their will. They had the debt problem, what I call the kiss of debt. And they imploded in part because the Soviets decided not to uphold them. So what I would say to Andy Walder, and I've had so many good conversations with him and learned so much, and his books on China are absolutely fundamental for me. I would say that the Chinese regime story is not over, just as Tom Finger was pointing out.
Okay. Great, thanks. All right, over back to the room, Scott Sagan.
Yeah, I'm Scott Sagan, professor of political science and co-director of Center for International Security and Cooperation, one of our sister centers here at FSI. You've more than once said that stories in the narrative are more important than the coercive mechanisms that authoritarian states use. And I'd like to know, how do you know that? I mean, how do you measure one is more powerful than the other, especially since coercive mechanisms are often used to try to prop up stories that are patently untrue. And you see that every day in Moscow today. So what's the relationship between, I guess, your factor number 1 and number 4, and how do you know one's more important than the other?
Yeah, I guess potentially I misspoke there, because what I was trying to say was that you cannot do without coercive mechanisms. Without coercive mechanisms, you've got nothing. You're undefended in an authoritarian regime. But if you only have coercive mechanisms, or if you rely only on coercive mechanisms, you're toast. Without the stories and narratives to reinforce the coercive mechanisms, and vice versa, just as you've said, you end up like the East European regimes, which implode. Your stories and narratives fail, and in fact, their failure turns out to help hollow out the coercive mechanisms. And so what I was trying to get at was that what's decisive, not only for the survival and functioning of these regimes, but even for the coercive mechanisms, are persuasive stories that have purchase in the population as well as among the elites. If you look at the situation in Russia today, and you watch Russian television as I do, you're on the Russian internet as I am, and you talk to Russian people who are still in Russia as I do, it's very clear that the stories that they're hearing through those media are resonating with them. The idea that the West is at fault, the idea that NATO expansion came at Russia's expense, the idea that Russia's greatness is being held down by the West, the idea that Russia is a special civilization with a special mission in the world, and one could go on. And so those stories have very considerable purchase, and might even have purchase were more alternative information available to the people, which is not available because of this censorship. So in the stories narratives category, that's where I put the censorship, which I call both suppression of information and promotion of information. But I said that in order for that stuff to work, in order for propaganda to work, there has to be some receptivity. Not 100% receptivity by any means. You also have out-migration, emigration, right? So you people who fled, 5 to 10 million Russians, depending, there's no census, but depending on how you count it, living abroad, living outside Russia, who've left in the past couple of decades, who don't participate in opinion polls and don't vote in elections, and left for a reason. Either they were forced out, or they felt that they couldn't stay there anymore, or they were pursuing economic opportunity. But in any case, that's a large potential opposition to the regime. However, even among many of those people who are now in exile, voluntary or involuntary, you will hear some of the themes that you also hear in the propaganda domestically under the repressive, coercive Putin regime censorship. And so I think I don't disagree with what you're saying, that the coercive mechanisms are essential. They're a sine qua non. I think I used that term. But without the narratives and the stories, which is both suppression and promotion, they can hollow out, and they're a limited instrument over a longer period of time without that stories dimension. So when I said that's why it's more important, that's what I meant. Not that it's a substitute for the coercive mechanisms, which nothing is.
Thank you.
All righty, thanks. Okay, I'm going to go back online here and then come back to the room. We probably only have time for 2 more questions, but let's see how we do. This one is from Andrew von Nordenflick. And he asks, does creating a more corrosive international system by making, that meaning for authoritarianism, corrosive for authoritarianism, by making tech transfer harder, denying access to Western financial systems, et cetera, does that inevitably create fuel for an anti-Western narrative within authoritarian countries? So is it circular? Can anti-authoritarian policy make progress on both of these pillars at the same time?
Yes, it can. You know, everything cuts both ways, right? All things that have benefits have costs and vice versa. You never get any clean policy tool. If you've ever been inside in a decision-making capacity of government or even an institution like Stanford, you know that the good choice carries downside risks and costs as well, right? So that's clearly the case. Let me say that the #1 tool for corroding authoritarian regimes is the shining example of excellent functioning of a liberal rule of law constitutional order, right? If people see it and don't even have to be propagandized, but look up to it and think it works really well and it's impressive and it delivers on its promises, that's enormously powerful, as we know. And so democracy promotion is a tool, but the example of democracy, the example of success, the example of pluralism working, of high standard of living and growing standard of living, ultimately is the most important of all your potential factors for making the world more conducive, right? If the values as enacted, as practiced, are not hypocritical, but successful, that's really powerful. It's not the only thing, but it's really powerful. I think everybody in the Center for Democracy and Rule of Law at Stanford understood that in the crib, and that's why they joined, you know, in the cradle at birth, and that's why they joined that institute. But you know, you just have to remember that everything has these downside risks, perverse and unintended consequences, and so you can never get anything 100% right. And so if you do blanket technology export controls, you can't enforce them, and you just show that you're incompetent. If you do targeted export controls on just a handful of really vital technologies, and instead you extend a hand on other technologies that you're willing to export. And so there are controls, and then there's an openness that you practice simultaneously. That goes a long way to reducing the anti-Westernism, not just in the country you're targeting, but in all the other audience countries like Southeast Asia, like South Asia, like the African continent, like Latin America, etc. So blanket technology export controls, blanket confrontation, blanket decoupling is, of course, very impossible effectively to implement, and also self-defeating in many ways.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, Don Emerson.
Yeah, my name is Don Emerson. I work on Southeast Asia. I'm fascinated by your presentation, and I think one can approach it from a number of different angles here, and I'm just going to pick one angle. Reduced to its absolute essence, you offer us a 5-part taxonomy. However, implicit in your treatment of the taxonomy is that it is in the service of causal explanation, the dependent variable being the success or failure of the regime. And structure and agency, the contrast between the two, come immediately to mind. Are you in fact ruling out sending off the stage the personality of the individual who has compiled this massive power that he, typically he rather than she, uses to maintain the authoritarian regime. I mean, obviously, I'm not recommending long distance psychoanalysis, but it seems to me that precisely because of that concentration in power, we can even less afford to ignore the role of personality, including the rogue role of personality, because let's remember that those 5 choices offer us a rational choice. Your presentation is about rationality and structure, and I'm talking about irrationality and agency. Does this in any way mess up the explanatory power of what you offer?
Well, thank you for that question. I don't think you're going to get a denial of agency, individual agency in a regime from me after so far 2,000 pages on Stalin with 1,000 pages to go.
Good.
So I think there's a mind melt here on this question. And authoritarian leaders are competent and incompetent, and that's a spectrum. That's not an either or, right? And they learn and they grow and they get better and they get worse. And the system over time also is affected by them. In other words, the system can get better or worse, as well as the leader, and they can decline together, or they can go in opposite directions where the system's performance gets better, ironically, but the leader's performance gets worse. There is no structure without agency. Without agency, structures don't happen. They don't get enacted. They don't begin to be set in motion. They don't have consequences the same way. And so, yes, the only thing I would say under the rubric of personalities matter enormously, so full agreement there, is that the personalities are not random who emerge inside these structures. And there's a way in which the systems select for certain types of people. And so, for example, Stalin, Mao, the Kim dynasty, and now Xi Jinping, you could argue, yes, they all have personalities, and yes, it's critical to analyze their personalities if you're looking at a policy framework, because influencing their decision-making or understanding the weaknesses and strengths of their decision-making is critical. But at the same time, there are accidents, but it's not random that these kind of people emerge, but more importantly, that they retain power over a long period of time. Because sometimes people can emerge and they're not very impressive and it is semi-accidental, but their ability to stay in power and grow in power indicates more than just accident or randomness. And so I would answer this both ways, Don. Personalities matter enormously, and systems have a way, at least partially, of selecting for certain types of personalities. And that's not necessarily a fully formed personality. You see, one of the main arguments of my Stalin work is that Stalin was not a fully formed person, and then he got into power and started wreaking havoc. It's Stalin got into power, and then the Stalin we know is formed in that position of being a despot inside and running Russian power in the world, a Eurasian landmass empire in an Anglo-American sea power, trade first dominated world, right? And so the system, when it selects, in some way shapes and forms the person who gets there. They get in that position, they see what the constraints are, they see what the policy options are, and sometimes you get a pattern there in addition to a personality.
Interesting. All right. Yeah, thanks. All right. So we actually have time if you can answer in a short question with a short answer, and I'm not sure you can, but I'm not sure what this person means exactly, whether it's modernization theory, but the question is this: can you touch on the connection between modernization, and they put this in quotation marks, and authoritarianism? So you could interpret that as, again, the Lipset theory of modernization, right? That it's a certain level of wealth, but that theory would predict democracy. Or you could interpret the question as whether or not authoritarianism is, as you've described it, is a distinctly modern phenomenon.
Yeah, I think there's everybody, in the room there and many of the people online know the story of modernization theory in its most simplistic form, which is to say you get economic development and then that has implications for political development. Often the political development follows the economic development. Not in every case, but in many cases. And that might be true. Let's say that that could be true or might not be true writ large. But in the communist case, it's not clear that that's true because of this conundrum of being unable to liberalize politically without liquidating yourself. It may be that the Chinese communists figure this out and they do find some reform equilibrium that no one else has found. I'm not a theoretician, I'm a historian. And there hasn't been in history a version of modernization theory that works for communist regimes. Maybe there could be such a thing in the future, but we have no historical case to lead us to think it's likely.
All right, well, Steve, it's my job, I guess, you ought to also thank you on behalf of the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law and APARC as well, our partners here. And thanks to my colleagues here in the room. Thank you to Amy for setting this up, and especially thanks to our friends online and for hanging in there. Steve, thank you so much for taking the time out of what I know is a very, very busy schedule to talk to us. Just really inspiring, thought-provoking presentation on a really important subject.
Thank you.
Thank you all.